Hi, everybody. This is part 1 of the 3 parts for chapter 10. And this chapter is going to talk about emotional development, attachment, and then temperament. And so this part will talk about emotional development. So emotion is defined as the subjective reaction that we experience in response to some environmental stimulus. And we all kind of have this intuitive sense of what emotion is. And emotion allows us to apply our intelligence and our knowledge to some sort of productive or meaningful end. So, for example, fight or flight is this emotional reaction where our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activate in order to deal with some sort of immediate danger. Sadness, for example, allows us to withdraw from something or to stop and reflect, right? Happiness allows us to communicate to the world that everything is fine, and communicate with others, right? And emotion in general allows us to communicate with others and allows us to help get what we want, to avoid danger, and to essentially just relay information. Now, as we know, emotional expression does not always correlate to actual emotion, but usually to emotion regulation. So we all have felt one way, maybe sad, and pretended our expression might have been different. But being able to do that is a function of our ability to regulate our emotions. Now, this functionalist approach where emotions have a very specific function that allows us to communicate effectively was proposed by Charles Darwin. So Darwin, in the book The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, essentially studied emotion across the animal kingdom and realized that changes in emotion usually are expressed through changes in some sort of facial muscles, right? So there are very specific facial expressions that relay happiness, and this is true for other animals as well. Emotional expressions that relate anger or fear or shame. And so facial expressions in humans and animals are based on the same physiological systems, and therefore they've evolved to express certain information to the world. And so, according to this functionalist approach, these emotions are universal, they're not due to learning, and they serve an adaptive function. So, Darwin described these 6 basic emotions that all animals have: anger, sadness, disgust, fear, happiness, and surprise. And you can see these emotions in all animals. They all have this disgust face. Well, not all animals, but mammals actually. They have this disgust face or disgust reaction, sadness or longing, happiness, certainly surprise, and certainly anger and fear. And so this functionalist approach, he proposed the discrete emotion theory, that these basic emotions are innate, meaning we are born with them, where they're not taught, and they're associated with distinct facial and bodily reactions, and they serve some sort of evolutionary function for survival. So, for example, joy or happiness serves to reinforce positive social relationships, right? We feel good when someone smiles at us. We feel like we belong. We feel like things are good. We're accepted. Disgust sends the message that something you're consuming is not good. So it tells other people to potentially avoid that item, to avoid contamination or illness, but also maybe to even avoid you because you have consumed that. Fear allows you to avoid danger, right? And also activates the fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system, which provides a boost of energy. Anger allows you to deal with threat and danger, but also relates to the world like, hey, back off, now is not the time, which, by the way, if someone is upset and angry, not the time to deal with them. Guilt and shame allow you to preserve social organization. So think about what guilt and shame is. It's this social emotion that when you know that you did not meet some sort of social norm. Like my dog used to look shamed when she used to pee on the carpet. Like I would walk in, and even if I didn't see the pee yet, I would know that she peed on the carpet, and I would have to go look for it because of the face that she had when I walked in the door, right? She had this shameful look, and therefore I know she broke some sort of rule or social norm. And sadness allows you not to waste resources, to abandon some sort of unattainable goal. Sadness is very functional. There's lots of research on depression, for example, about how depression, in its mild form, allows a person to stop and reflect on how they are spending their time and resources, and it essentially tells the person, hey, what your environment is not good for you, so you need to fix something. And it usually is a functional tool. Now moderate to severe depression becomes not so functional, but uh, at its basis, sadness is very functional. So what about emotional development? So when we're talking about emotional development, we're talking about four categories. We're talking about when can children, let me pull up my laser pointer, when can children express clearly different emotions, which is when can they have emotional expression? When can they recognize or become aware of emotions, or what is their emotional recognition? When can they verbally label and comprehend the use of emotions, emotional understanding? And when can they control their emotional expression, aka emotional regulation? So we're going to talk about each of these. So emotional expression is split up into two quote unquote phases, like primary and secondary emotions. Primary emotions usually emerge during the first year of life, and they are joy, sadness, anger, surprise, fear, um, disgust, and distress. These should sound familiar if you've ever seen the movie Inside Out. Yep, Inside Out. Um, because Inside Out is an amazing movie where they do a really good job of talking both about emotional development and about memory development. And so um, the first emotions that come up are joy, then sadness, then disgust, fear, and anger. And then they kind of coexist, and you can have an array of emotions by combining these, right? So, um, uh, disgust and fear is revulsion, anger and disgust is loathing, fear and sadness is anxiety, fear and joy is surprise, right? So you can get all of these emotional expressions just from the combination of these five. And these primary emotions are hypothesized to be quote unquote innate and are part of our evolutionary history. And therefore, we should find them across cultures and develop roughly at the same time for all children. And in fact, that is true. We do find these emotional uh, um, expressions in the first year of life for every single human, regardless of what society they are raised in, regardless of whether it's appropriate to engage in these behaviors or emotions, and regardless of whether it's westernized, a developing country, or hunter-gatherer societies. And we see that they develop roughly at the same time, suggesting that there is this deep evolutionary history for these primary emotions. Um, Now, these primary emotions, like I said, from a functional perspective, have very distinct purposes. So, for example, facial responses to unpleasant foods, signaling disgust, have the purpose of dispelling a food from the mouth. So, I just started feeding Rachel soft solids because she's 4 months, and apparently that's when you start with food. And I gave her a piece of avocado, and instantly it was like this look of, why is this in my mouth? And she spit it out, right? She had this disgust face, which essentially stops her from breathing in and inhaling. And then spits it out. So what she's doing is expelling the food from her mouth so that if this is a potential contaminant, it won't harm her. And we see sadness as evidenced by consistent frowning to certain stimuli in 2 months old, right? Granted, it's more consistent after 6 months, but usually that's usually in response to some sort of separation from the caregiver. Before that, it's in response to not being in a situation that they like or being overwhelmed, right? But as early as 2 months. And there's some evidence that babies show fear to some stimuli because they are born prepared to learn fear of that stimuli. So, for example, in a series of study, Deloche and Labou tested to see if infants and toddlers are naturally fearful of snakes. And at first, if you just give a baby a snake, they actually don't show any fear. They have no fear response. But if you present that snake paired with a fearful voice or a fearful face, those infants and toddlers look longer in the snakes than any other stimuli and eventually showed fear. And motion is important too. So if you just show a picture of a snake, it's not as bad as if you show a live video of a snake. And so if you show a live video of a snake paired with a fearful voice or a fearful face, babies show fear to the snake, even though they didn't necessarily have this fear to begin with. And what that suggests is that babies are born prepared to learn to fear certain stimuli. In another study, also by Deloche and Labou, they had older children, look at images like this, where it's a 3x3 matrix, right? 3 images by 3 images. And what they have to do essentially is find the snake or find the image that is different, right? And so what Deloche and Labou found was that children, I think the youngest that she tested was 3-year-olds, were able to find the snake significantly faster in a series of flowers than to find a flower in a series of snakes, right? Suggesting that there's this attentional bias towards finding snakes rather than looking for other stimuli. Then we have secondary emotions, and secondary emotions are also called self-conscious emotions, and they emerge around the second year of life, usually between 12 and 16 months. And these are shame, guilt, pride, empathy. These are all requiring the realization that there are certain expectations, there are certain rules, social norms, and so children feel these and express these when they have violated some social norm, which is why we sometimes call these moral emotions, right? Guilt is when you know you did something that you weren't supposed to do. Empathy is when you feel bad because someone else feels bad, right? Now, this emerges around the second year of life because it's related to maturation in the frontal cortex, and is very much related to the child being able to understand social norms, right? So they have to have some sort of understanding of what is typical and what is not. So that is related to environmental influences and culture. Okay. The second topic when talking about emotional development is emotional recognition. And the truth is that this happens very early on. So from minutes after birth, babies exhibit what we call neonatal imitation, which you see in these images here. So neonatal imitation is when the baby sees an adult exhibit some sort of face and they imitate it. Now, this does not mean that they understand the emotion, but they certainly recognize that the emotion that an adult is expressing. And so if you smile, they'll try to smile. If you pout, they try to pout, or they purse their lips and their eyebrows. And if you open your mouth, they open their mouth as well. And babies in general are very sensitive to emotions of other adults, children, and babies. So, for example, they contagiously cry. So, if they're around other babies that cry, they'll start crying, even though there's nothing wrong. They imitate facial expressions, and they're very sensitive to mother's reactions, specifically smiling. And motherese, right? Parentese, this register of sounds that we do when we speak with babies. And so they are very quick to replicate the emotion of a mom. So if a baby's crying and the mom looks up at her and starts smiling and uses motherese to say, "Hi, you're okay, it's okay," and she's smiling, and the baby's more likely to recognize that emotion and change their emotion to match. And at 6 months, infants begin being able to recognize more emotional expressions from voice and facial expressions. So they essentially, what we call social reference, which is they look to the parents for how to react to a situation. So they reference an adult that they know and trust to see whether something is okay. And so this is usually emerges around the time when the baby is mobile or becoming mobile. So at around 6 months, they're able to sit up on their own. They're maybe able to scoot a little bit. They're able to roll over pretty consistently. And so at this stage, if they roll over and let's say they hit their head, then they'll look at the mom or the dad. And if the mom goes, "Uh-oh," or has like a scared face, then the baby will start crying. Or if the baby rolls over, hits his head, and looks over at the mom and says, and the mom is smiling and says, "You're okay," in like a happy voice, and the baby smiles and moves on, right? And this is true for also like 3 and 4 year olds. Very common in preschool and nursery playgrounds, where if the child falls and hurts themselves, they look to the teacher or they look to the mom or whoever the adult is, the trusted adult. And if the adult's like, "Hey, you're fine," and smiles or says very calmly, like, "You're okay," then the child is okay, unless they're really hurt. And if someone's like, "Oh no, are you okay?" and they have this emotional reaction, the child recognizes that this is bad, and then it tells them how to react themselves. The third category is emotional understanding. And emotional understanding is not necessarily just recognizing what the emotion is, but understanding what that emotion uh, tells us, right? Which is pretty crucial for our complex social world. We communicate with lots of people, we have to relay lots of emotions, and emotional understanding is kind of necessary in order for us to be functioning people in our society. Now, we can't necessarily test emotional understanding super early on because it usually involves language. So, the three main stages start at around 3 when children are pretty proficient at basic communication. And so the three major stages of emotional understanding starts between 3 to 7 year olds, which are able to recognize complex emotions and the cues associated with them. At 7 to 9, they begin to understand the role of, let's say, desires and beliefs on emotions and their ability to hide emotions. This is usually when lying becomes much easier. It doesn't mean that 3 to 7 year olds don't lie. It just means that 7 to 9 year olds are able to be better liars because they have the ability to hide their emotions because they understand, hey, if I got a gift and I don't like it and I say, "Ew, this is disgusting, I hate this sweater," they're going to get in trouble, right? So they're able to hide their emotions and fake it much more effectively than 3 to 7 year olds. And then 9 to 11 year olds begin to understand the mixture of nature of emotions, whereas before it might be a little confusing that they have all these emotions. They don't know what to do with them. They begin to be able to regulate emotions better, and they begin to include morality on their emotions, where they make decisions based on right and wrong more consistently. Again, it does not mean that 7 to 9 year olds don't. It just means that 9 to 11 year olds do it more consistently and more effectively. So one study that tested emotional understanding by Pon and colleagues tested 3 to 11-year-olds where they were told a story about Tom. And Tom hates lettuce. And then Peter, who loves lettuce. And then the child is asked, would Tom and Peter be happy, sad, just right, or scared if they got lettuce? And so Tom should be happy, and Peter, no, sorry. Tom should be sad because he hates lettuce, and Peter, who loves lettuce, should be happy. And so 20% of 3-year-olds were able to accurately say that Tom, who hates lettuce, should be sad, and Peter, who loves lettuce, should be happy. 55% of 5-year-olds and 75% of 7-year-olds. So their ability to understand emotions and what is related to reactions increases over time. Another study by Pons, they tested 3 to 11-year-olds, and they said that Tom got a bike for his birthday, but he thinks he may fall off and hurt himself because he's never ridden before. So is Tom happy, sad and scared, happy and scared, or just scared? And so the correct response is that he's happy and scared, or just scared, right? Either one can be argued. And so they would ask them why. But 20% of 7-year-olds, because this is a complex emotion, right? It's mixing happy and scared. Only 20% of 7-year-olds, but 65% of 9-year-olds and 90% of 11-year-olds were able to accurately justify that he's happy because he got a bike for his birthday, but he's scared because he's never ridden before. Or he's scared because he's never ridden before, and bikes are scary, right? Their justification also mattered. Don't worry about this study right here. I meant to delete it and I moved it down and just forgot to delete it. And finally, emotion regulation. So emotion regulation takes a huge curve as children get older, because in reality, newborns have zero control over their emotions, right? They don't have the ability to self-regulate. They don't have the ability to control their emotions, let alone their body movements or pretty much anything else. However, simple forms of regulation do develop quite quickly. So around 3 months, they can start to soothe themselves by sucking on a pacifier or withdrawing from overstimulation. We saw this earlier in a video where if the baby is exposed to too much sound, they'll force themselves to sleep, right, in order to not be overstimulated. They begin to use adult references for emotions around the age of 1, aka social referencing that we talked about. And then emotion regulation usually picks up around the age of 3 when they can understand social norms and how it relates to their emotions. So by the age of 3, children can pretend that a bad tasting drink is good, and their ability to actually effectively do this, right, to actually fool an adult, increases with age. And males are poorer than this than females are. Females are much better at lying and regulating emotions than males are, even into adulthood. Now, emotion regulation is associated with emotional problems that we see later on in childhood and early adolescence in the form of either internalizing or externalizing behavior. So internalizing behavior are things such as anxiety, depression, stress behaviors, and it usually only affects the people that experience it in this. So they're taking their problems and they're internalizing it emotionally. And this is much more common in girls and women across pretty much every culture. And externalizing behaviors are acting out, throwing temper tantrum, violence, hitting, punching. And this is much more common in boys and usually results in adolescence in the form of oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder, which are rare, but nonetheless a function of how boys externalize their emotional regulation problems. There's lots of evidence to suggest that part of the reason why boys experience a high rate of emotional regulation issues is we tell them that it's not okay to cry. And they are essentially taught to suppress emotional expression, and therefore they can't emotionally regulate because they never learn how to deal with their emotions and therefore have these emotional problems. But of course, just like everything else, emotion regulation is a function of gene environment interactions. So essentially, what gene you have might predict, not dictate, but predict and be associated with how you express your emotions and whether that results in emotional issues. So in this graph, we have gene environment interaction and teen depression. So this is the proportion of the population that is depressed. And this is in a low rejection environment, meaning a positive environment. This is a high rejection environment, meaning a very terrible environment. The child feels rejected in their homes. And CC, CT, and TT are three alleles of one particular strand of gene that is associated with depression. And what they find is that in low rejection environments, so in positive environments, the proportion that are depressed does not matter depending on these genes. Okay, so whether you're CC, CT, or TT genes, there really isn't much of a difference. So you could make the argument that here's like around 0.3, like 30%, and this over here is a little under 2. So that could be a difference, but it's not statistically meaningful. However, if you have this TT strand and you're in a bad environment, in this high rejection environment, the proportion of individuals with this gene, this allele of this gene, are proportionally more depressed than those that have the CC and CT gene, suggesting that your expression of depression is not just a function of your environment, right? Because otherwise all crappy environment individuals would be depressed. But if you're in a crappy environment and you have a specific gene, then those two things interact to result in a higher chance of teen depression. And for a summary of emotional expression, recognition, understanding, and self-regulation, what their descriptions are, and how they develop, this is a very quick summary graph for you. And that's all I got for emotional development. Please make sure you listen to part 2 and part 3 of this chapter lecture.